Unions are calling for an end to the public sector pay cap and an end to austerity. So with Norfolk County Council facing even more cuts, is it time to change direction, or do we need to save money now more than ever? Good evening. It's been 7 years since the Conservative coalition government began their policy of austerity in response to the financial crisis of 2007. George Osborne announced £81 billion of cuts over 4 years in his first budget because he said the country needed to pay off the national debt. But with public services facing intense pressure and public sector pay capped at 1%, the policy has come under a lot of scrutiny lately. So is it time to end austerity? Here to talk about this is Jonathan Moore, the chairman of Equal Lives, and Steve Morphew, the leader of the Labour group at Norfolk County Council. Also with us this evening, John Fisher from the Norwich Conservatives and Richard Porritt, the political editor at the Eastern Daily Press. So let's talk a bit about austerity. What's been the impact on the people who you talk to day in, day out?
Well, we've discovered that austerity has mostly decimated the lives of disabled people, and that's not an exaggeration. You know, public services and adult social care in particular have been absolutely, well, as I say, decimated. There have been cuts to people's benefits and services, things that I should emphasise to people aren't a luxury. These are things that are needed by our members and by disabled people generally. And I think this austerity plan has led to a lot of misery for a lot of vulnerable people, and it's got to stop now.
OK. Steve Morphew, David Cameron and George Osborne said in 2010 it was really needed. Do you accept that back then we did need to do something like that?
I recognise that something needed to be done. I think austerity is a political choice, and that was the choice that they made. It was a choice that most of the public went along with. I don't think that I ever went along with it. I do understand that there are times when you need to tighten your belt, but if you are going to tighten your belt, then you make sure it's the right people that get hit, not the vulnerable people in society that get hit. But enough is enough, and whether it was right, whether it's wrong, it's now time to bring it to an end.
It has been extremely unpopular, hasn't it, John Fisher?
Not to start with, I don't believe. No, I think there was a need, as Steve said, there was a need to start with, I think, to tighten our belts, to control public spending. And I think a certain amount of that was done successfully. I think there was a need to look into social care, and there was certainly a lot of waste identified in social care. I'm not disputing what has been said that maybe it went over the top, but there was a lot of money being spent on what were luxuries, and you do have to tighten your belt. And I think as a party, we've got a difference of opinion throughout now as to whether we should be ending it or whether we shouldn't. I still think there's a need to keep an eye on public expenditure. I mean, we're not out of the woods yet. And from that point of view, when you're looking at public pay...
and where do you sit? Do you think it's time to end it now?
I think looking at some of it, it's time to consider whether we need to be quite so severe as we have been for the last 7 years. I think certain aspects of public pay maybe need to be looked at.
Mm-hmm. So maybe take the brakes off a little.
And maybe take the brakes off a little. I believe maybe reassess the total aspect of public sector pay, because it varied. The demands vary so much across the country. I think there's scope for looking at local pay scales, which might be more realistic.
And we'll talk about some of those possible solutions in a little while. I just want to ask Richard Porritt, I mean, when this began, it was about paying down the deficit. So can we get a handle on how effective that has been? Has it worked?
Well, all the figures are very complex, and depending on who you speak to and from what party they're from, you'll get a different answer. There's a difference between the deficit, there's a difference between debt, there's a difference between the structural deficit, and there's a difference between borrowing. And I'm not the man probably to explain all those things, but if we look at deficit as a percentage of GDP, then yes, it has gone down. It reached in 2000 and 2009, so just before the coalition government, it was more than 10%. I think it's down now to about 2.5%. So yes, it has gone down, but of course borrowing hasn't followed. So those two, when George Osborne announced austerity, there were two things that he was after doing: getting that deficit down, obviously, and making it into a surplus, and cutting the borrowing as well. So success or failure, it depends who you ask, frankly.
OK, all right. Well, the County Council has been feeling the pinch under the austerity programme. It's already saved or budgeted for cuts of $334 million, and a few weeks ago it announced it would have to save another 125. Conservative leader of the council, Cliff Jordan, feels it is time for austerity to end.
Well, I think the government have realised that from the last election that the public had had enough of austerity. They had 7 years of it, and I think that the government now realise that maybe they've had enough of it, because we're at the sharp end of the ship, and the austerity is felt through the services or non-services that are provided by the council. So I would like to think that the government have heard, but we are involved in telling them again. So it's the old proverb, tell them what you've told them, but tell them again.
Cliff Jordan, the leader of the County Council. Has local government taken too much of a hit, do you think, in the way this has been done?
Absolutely. Interestingly, at the Local Government Association conference that I was at and Cliff was at last week, Lord Porter of Spalding, who's almost a local lad and definitely not my political persuasion but something I know quite well, said in his keynote speech that local government was at the front of the queue when the cuts came in, and it was now the time that they were at the front of the queue when the tap for money started getting turned on again. Local government has done remarkable things with the amounts of money that they've had left, and they've had to do some horrible things at the same time as well. So I think, yes, absolutely, it's time, and for once, I actually do agree with Cliff.
And this is something you've been campaigning on, Jonathan Moore, isn't
it? Yes, it is. I mean, can I just say, in the interest of fairness and democracy, thank you very much, Cliff Jordan, for saying we are trying to tell the LGA that we can't keep going like this. We are, as he said, at the sharp end of the ship, and I deal day in, day out with the people who really are at the sharp end of the ship. And I sit in the meetings of, for example, Norfolk County Council Adult Social Care Committee, and I've heard people say, for God's sake, when you write to the LGA and tell them we can't keep going like this, you can't cut forever, because sooner or later, as people already have, if you think about the mental health services, things like that, people have died.
But I suppose, I must ask John Fisher, I suppose some people, if they're supporting this policy, would say, well, if you've got to cut somewhere, where's it going to come?
You've got to cut somewhere. I think there are instances that have been brought to my attention where, in fact, there is still a lot being spent on adult social services in what I would still call luxury. There are still people being paid to go to London shows. And whole families being paid to go to London shows, which I don't believe actually is justifiable. When you're looking at certainly support for the disabled, yes, but should there be a whole family, for example, go to Disneyland and all of their meals paid as part of that's taxpayers' money, and I think that has to be realised. I'm not saying that there hasn't been issues, but there are still a lot of issues on the table that still need addressing.
Is that happening?
Well, I was going to ask Mr. Fisher, do you have evidence for this?
I certainly do. I can't give it to you now, obviously, because we're in a public forum.
Yes.
But people would not be bringing that to my attention if that was not true, would they?
But this is not the same as austerity. Austerity is a choice of policy to squeeze down public spending. It's not about the choices of how the money is spent.
And would the budgets have been looked at if there hadn't been the austerity to start with?
Well, that's a different question altogether. The issue that austerity was supposed to deal with was paying down the deficit, not about efficiency. Now, this is deliberate cuts that hurt people, not about making things efficient. And if you mix up the two, the efficiency and the cuts, then what you finish up with is a very complicated argument where people are allowed to suffer in the interest of something called efficiency, and it's just a false premise.
Okay.
It's worth noting, though, isn't it, that that Labour also were going to embark on austerity in 2010. I mean, Alistair Darling said 2 parliaments of pain. So is it more about the severity of the austerity that the coalition and subsequently the Tories have done?
There isn't any doubt about there was need to pull in your coat and do things a bit differently, and there always should be a focus on efficiency. So I have no problem with that at all. But if you're feeling cold, you can either turn the heating down and just wait until your boiler packs up and freeze to death or whatever. Alternatively, you can look at improving your insulation, investing some money, getting the boiler working better, and then if you need to pay it off, the cost of doing that off, then you turn the heating down as well. But at the moment, all we've done is just made everybody cold, and there isn't any sign of everything going right.
Exactly, Mr. Morphew, and that's the question. It's a matter of, one, who gets hit, and in terms of things like adult social care, we need a root and branch re-examination, in my opinion, and in the opinion of my members and officers, into how it's done.
Okay, well, there's been a lot of...
I would endorse that 100%. We do need to look at that whole section of the county council and see where the money is actually going, because I don't believe it's going in the right direction, and the only way to do that is to study the budget.
OK, well, there's been a lot of criticism for austerity, as we've heard, but there is some support for the policy. John O'Connor, who's the Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, says the Chancellor is right to offer caution on public sector pay and say that we need a grown-up debate about spending. The nation's public finances are still in a dire state, so it would be unwise to pander to those looking for easy answers for difficult questions. He says we must not forget the huge long-term cost of taxpayers on other benefits, such as public sector pensions, which are more generous than those on offer in the private sector, and the long-term liabilities of these pensions are kept off the books, and it's future generations, he says, who will have to pick up the tab. I mean, this is, Richard Porritt, incredibly complicated and difficult for any government to deal with, isn't it?
It's hugely difficult, yes, and how they go about presenting it to the public is difficult as well. It seems now that there is that Labour have won votes on the back of opposing it, but that didn't seem to be the case in 2015. So there's lots of things are shifting. They do feel like the sands do feel like they're shifting a little bit at the moment, and of course, especially with the cabinet starting to have a bit of a fight among themselves about whether the spending cap should be relaxed. But it seems that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have got their ducks in a row and are sticking with it for now. OK, we'll have to wait and see what happens. Do stay with us. After the break, we'll be talking more about austerity and what could be done instead. Welcome back. Tonight we're talking about austerity and whether it's time to end the cuts to public services that we've seen over the last 7 years. On the panel this evening, from Equal Lives, Jonathan Moore, and from the Labour Party, Steve Morphew. Also with us this evening from the Conservatives, John Fisher, and the EDP's political editor, Richard Porritt. Well, we saw in the general election the Labour Party, although it didn't win, did do better than many expected on the back of an anti-austerity agenda. So, what are the alternatives? Let's hear again from County Council leader Cliff Jordan.
Collectively, local governments think it's done its bit and more. I think they've been targeted too hard. We think that the government should look at its own coffers, look at itself. And we, collectively, want to get on delivering the services to our public.
Cliff Jordan there. So he says the government should look at its own coffers, but it's complicated, isn't it? Because if it doesn't come out of this pot, it'll have to come out of that pot. It's going to affect somebody somewhere, I guess. Yeah, and there's the popular pots to take from things like foreign aid budgets and that kind of thing. But there's lots of good arguments to keep every pot exactly how it is. Obviously, health and education, I think, was ring-fenced from the start, so they may have seen less spending relatively, but they haven't seen cuts. But where does it come from? It is tricky, and I think what many people are saying now is that there has been a disproportionate effect on those at the bottom of society, and those who are maybe higher up society are a little bit more able to insulate themselves against the sort of the cuts that austerity has brought. Well, Jeremy Corbyn did do better than we thought. I mean, he didn't win, he's not Prime Minister, but, I mean, what would Labour do differently if you were in charge?
Well, there isn't a silver bullet. If there was, somebody would have fired it by now. So it is a mix of using borrowing money, indeed, putting up taxes, putting money from other places, and actually recognising this is part of the whole economy, rather than just something which you look at in a microcosm. Now, certainly if you look in terms of the cuts to Norfolk, £350 million, give or take, it's not just the vulnerable people that are hurting. What we've actually lost is thousands of jobs, and that's just Norfolk County Council. With all of the other public sector organisations, that's not just jobs that have been lost, that's money out of the Norfolk economy. All of those hundreds of millions of pounds get spent in corner shops, they get spent in garages, they get spent on clothes, they get spent on going down the pub. And the people whose jobs are created as a result of that spending also spend the money within the economy. It's hurting Norfolk as a whole. And if we do have that money back, then it actually grows the economy and makes us all better off by doing it.
Would it do that, grow the economy and make us all better off?
It's interesting. At the moment, we've got the lowest unemployment figures ever, and yet Steve's just saying lots of people have been made redundant and taken out of employment.
They have, but they're good jobs that we've lost, and what we've got are not such good jobs.
What we've actually got is people being employed, and those people still spending money down the local shops. And it does mean, in fact, that those people are looking after themselves more, and rather than the taxpayers looking after themselves and employing too many people in the public sector, which I think was the case. I've worked in the private sector. I was never guaranteed a pay rise. I certainly was not guaranteed a job unless we were making a profit. And at the start of the recession, I was running a workshop where, in fact, we had 8 people. Spent 6 months clearing up the workshop to ensure that we kept those people on our books for when things turn better. Now, that actually is realism and being realistic about what we're doing.
No, it's not. We've got low skilled, we've got low paid jobs, we've got jobs
in the local, unfortunately, in the public sector, those people are guaranteed a job, or they were guaranteed a job, whether they liked it or not, and it was time to look at some of that. And it has
Let's just ask Jonathan Moore. Are you seeing people who were on benefits who are now getting into work? Is that happening?
Well, in our experience, no, it isn't, because there are people are trying to apply for jobs. I think the Tories have this misconception that we're all certain strata of society. We're all layabouts. We don't want to actually go and work, but we do. And
that's why there's minimum unemployment at the minute, because actually people are working. That's the fact of it.
Yes,
people are working. There's less unemployed than there ever has been before. So I've no idea where you're coming from with that particular statement that we think you're all liable. We actually think that people deserve to work, and that is the way to a better life. It's actually a way, and I know because I spent maybe a month unemployed. When you find you've got a job, you actually feel a lot better in yourself, and you have a lot better way of life.
But listen, we've had the gig economy report just in the last 24 hours or so. We've seen low skilled, low wage. Jobs that are replacing the high-skilled, high-wage jobs, unsecured jobs replacing very secure jobs. Now, in terms of the future, that's what we want for the good jobs.
And we're drifting onto employment, and I want to focus on austerity and what do we do about it and how do we pay for things. Now, the government said many times the country needs to live within its means and not spend as much as in the past. So what are the other options? Let's hear from Jonathan Dunning from Unison.
The post-war Labour government under Clement Attlee invested enormously in public services. It rebuilt bombed cities, it invested in the NHS services, all at the time when we were in huge amount of debt to the United States as a result of them loaning us a lot of the money. And to view, as Margaret Thatcher did, economic policy like a household budget is a flawed approach. And if you want the logic behind that, there are economists out there who can explain that. But basically, governments can print money, and it doesn't have to have a negative impact on the standard of living and care services that people receive.
Jonathan Dunning from Unison. Now, I'm not going to ask you to explain quantitative easing, printing money. That's what he's talking about. But it can be done, can't it? And it was done after the banking crisis.
Yes, both here and in the United States. And I think the States did it for longer than we did, actually.
They did.
And I think whatever flavour of government we would have had for the years that we did it would have done the same. I think it was probably the right thing to do.
But why not do it now? Could we do it now, John Fisher? Print money?
I don't think we're at the point where we need to print money now. George Osborne was very keen on quantitative easing, as was the then Bank of England chief. I believe we're now looking at things differently. I think we can. I'm not saying we can't end austerity. I think we need to consider what else we can do to actually invent more money into public finances, and actually at the end of the day, whether it's national government cuts, whether it's local government cuts, or whether it's national government expenditure or local government expenditure, the same people are paying for it. The taxpayers are paying for it, and I think you need to have a little bit of respect every now and again for those people. I'm not saying, as Steve said earlier, about the report on the gig economy. Yes, there are some people that maybe some of the jobs need to be looked at. Maybe need to move forward.
There's actually a great deal of people in that position. That's what creates a cycle of being on benefits, is low-wage, unsecured jobs. As Mr. Morphew said.
We haven't got a huge amount of time.
I was talking to a gentleman at the weekend who's 80, and he said to get his house he needed 3 jobs. Okay, now that was 60 years ago.
Okay.
Now, I'm not saying we need to move forward, and we have moved forward, but these issues are always there. Every now and again, there is not enough money to go around.
All right, let's talk about public sector pay, because it's a really big issue at the moment. There's been a lot about talk about impact of workers of the public sector pay cap, but could it be about to come to an end? Andy Simmons from the Police Federation says if pay doesn't go up soon, they could lose more staff.
I've seen quite a few officers now, a steady increase in officers coming into our office and say, how do I go about resigning, what do I have to do? Because it's something they've never ever considered before. But along with all the pay cap, the austerity and the pressures that they face, they've decided actually, is this job, it's made them think for the first time probably ever in their career, is this job for me? So we haven't been greedy, we haven't been unnecessarily saying we should get back what we're owed. And it's not about that, it's making sensible, professional and evidence-based decisions. And that's what we want, that's why we've asked for 2.8%.
2.8% he's asking for. At the moment, most of them are capped at 1%. It's hard to argue, isn't it, about giving police officers and nurses and saying, well, you can't have any more money.
Absolutely. That's what I'm saying. I think if we looked at local pay rates, for example, in Norfolk, we're short of social workers. They're on a national pay scale. What we need is a flexibility to say, right, we need to vary this and we need to judge what local private sectors and public sectors are worth in the environment.
MPs got more than that, didn't they? Was it 11% last year?
Well, they got 11% in 2015. They only got 1.4 last year. So,
okay. So it's not so bad. And there's only 600 or 50 of them.
They don't vote for it themselves either. It's independently assessed. So.
And the public sector pay cap. I mean, I'm guessing you want it to change and now, but is it affordable?
Well, yes, it should be affordable because I think public sector workers have played a full part. Everybody's prepared to do their bit. I think they've done their bit. What people are asking for now is still pretty modest after all of this time. And frankly, if they don't do something about it pretty soon, resentment's going to start building up, and that's when we start facing trouble.
But is it just plain party politics by saying, well, yeah, we'll give them the money, it's what we need? It's a popular thing.
No, not at all. I think they deserve it, to be perfectly honest. I mean, you can screw people down into the ground for long enough, eventually they're going to leave, morale's going to go, or they're going to start looking at industrial action. We don't want any of those things to happen. So being fair to them means that they'll be fair to us, or continue to be fair to us. They couldn't have been fairer over the last several years. I'm amazed at the amount of tolerance and goodwill that there's been in the public sector.
We're just about out of time. I just want to, will the public sector pay gap, do you think it will be lifted, Richard, just briefly? No, why not?
Well, they've already told teachers they're not getting it. They said it would be unfair to nurses, so I think that tells us everything we need to know.
All right, thank you. I'm so sorry, we are out of time. That is all we've got time for this evening, and thank you to all for taking part. If you'd like to get in touch, we're on Facebook at Mustard TV, and we're on Twitter at Mustard This Week. Until next time, good night.